Hi everybody. Hope everyone's doing okay. It's kind of a crazy time these days, but anyway, hope everyone's safe and doing and is healthy and stuff like that. This is the first time I've ever done online lectures, so you'll have to bear with me. I'll try my best, but yeah, it's kind of a learning curve for me. You can email me if you have any difficulties understanding the material or if you need any clarifications, but I'll try to be as clear as possible. My understanding is that the tutor is still available, so you can also call her. I think she can do some kind of video conference thing if you need to go over any slides or anything with her too. So today we're moving on to the next section, minerals, pretty much the last section of the class. We're going to start with calcium and other macrominerals, and then we're going to go into the microminerals. So just to kind of go over a bit of the basics, the key functions of the minerals, the main one is really kind of like bones and teeth, kind of just that type of thing. It's also a medium for cell activity, also helps with osmotic properties of body fluids, so that means like electrolytes. And then it's also involved in metalloenzymes. So all these things we're going to go into a lot more detail as we go through every single mineral. But the first question is really, well, what's the difference between a macromineral and a micromineral? So you might have heard those terms before, and I'll tell you exactly which minerals classify as each. So a macromineral, would that be based on like dietary intake or how much is in the body? How do they classify those things? So the way that we classify micro versus macro is based on diet intake. So a macromineral is defined as anything that we consume or we need more than 100 milligrams per day. And then a micromineral is anything where we need less than 100 milligrams per day. So pretty simple. And then so what are the actual micro versus macro minerals? Macrominerals, those are fairly easy to remember because it's basically the ones involved in bone, so calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. And then also all the electrolytes, so that would be sodium, potassium, and chloride. And then the microminerals are just everything else. And so these are the ones we're going to learn about in this class. Iron, zinc, copper, selenium, chromium, iodine, and fluoride. So those are the micros. So if you can just remember that macros are the bone ones and then the electrolytes, then everything else is the micros. So these are the questions that if I actually had anyone in front of me that I'd ask, well, what are the functions of calcium in the body? Most people know that it's involved in bone mass, kind of calcium homeostasis and bone building. But what are some of the other ones? So things that I would want you to think about are, where else have we talked about calcium in this lecture series? And if you remember, we talked about it a little bit here and there. So nerve conduction, muscles, so muscle contraction, also blood clotting. So not just bones, but we're going to go through all those in a little bit. And then what disease state is associated with calcium or low levels of calcium. We talked about that in our last vitamin D lecture. So that would be basically osteoporosis and then rickets as well. So just to give you a bit of background on kind of how much calcium we actually have in the body, it is the most abundant divalent cation in the body. So we actually carry around 1,400 grams or about 3 pounds of just sheer calcium in our bodies. So we have a lot of this mineral in our bodies. Most of it is in bones and teeth, so 99% of it. And then 1% of it is kind of in intra and extracellular fluids. Food sources are basically kind of what you think. Main ones are dairy, so milk, yogurt, cheese, that type of thing. If it's helpful, you can write on the top of your slide or anywhere that the RDA for calcium for premenopausal women and men is 1,000 milligrams per day. And then for postmenopausal women, it's 1,200 milligrams. So if you want to then kind of compare how much you need, you'll see with the dairy products, you need about 3 or 4 servings of dairy products to meet those calcium needs. It's also found in some other things like beans or bok choy, in other words, like vegetables and legumes and stuff like that. But things I do want you to keep in mind is that it's not really found in meats, unfortified grains. So if bread's unfortified, you're not really going to find high levels of calcium there. And nuts also don't have really high amounts of it. There's tons and tons of stuff now that's fortified with calcium just because osteoporosis has become a really big problem. You've probably seen tons of these products all over the grocery store. One of the ones that really stands out is orange juice. That one has usually about 1/3 of what you need for the day. So the Tropicanas and stuff like that, there's a whole bunch of basically calcium ones. Then there's also the alternative milk, so soy milk, oat milk, almond milk. Most of those have calcium at the level of actual dairy milk, like cow milk. So it's usually around 300 milligrams per day, and those are all fortified as well to that level. There's also fortified breads, and then if you look at kind of cereal products, they usually only fortify to about 15% from what I've seen, so not a really great source. If you remember with the B vitamins, there was more like, it was up to like 25 or 30% of your B vitamins were in cereal, but calcium a little bit less. There are specific cereals that have, I think like Total, or I forget what it's called. There's certain cereals that have like really high amounts, but most don't. So just keep that in mind. Cocoa powder, like hot chocolate powder, actually has kind of more than you would think, about 100 milligrams per day. So just to point that out too. Calcium in supplements, in general, there's a bunch, but the most popular one and the one that's kind of most commonly seen if you start reading the labels is calcium carbonate. That's also the cheapest for some reason. I'll show you in a couple slides later, but it's the best absorbed and it's also the cheapest. So I'd probably go for that one. Just some notes on actual supplements and how to take them. Calcium supplements are usually really big. So they're honestly about, if you've ever seen them or had to take them, they're almost like an inch long. Like they're kind of like the typical like horse pill thing when you think about it. You need to take them, in general, it's recommended that you take them with meals. But a really important thing that I mentioned a little while ago is that you cannot take them with iron. If you have a client or a patient that needs both calcium and iron, you can take the calcium with your meals. So let's say 500 in the morning with breakfast, and then 500 maybe with dinner at night. But then the iron has to be kind of between meals. Iron you have to do far away from calcium, because what would happen is the calcium and iron bind each other in the gut lumen, and then both of them are excreted and you don't get either of them. So just make sure to take iron at least 2 hours away from calcium. And then in order to get your daily dose of calcium, you would usually need 2 pills. And they usually say to stagger them, at different meals of the day. So you don't want to take them both at the same time, because then absorption would be lower. Other things just to keep in mind, you're never going to find like a multivitamin or anything that has 100% of your calcium needs. And again, that's just because they're so big. They're really bulky tablets, just because you're literally eating 500, a lot of calcium. Other things to point out, Tums is actually a really good source of calcium. You can actually take those instead of calcium supplements. Most Tums have about, like 200 to 300 milligrams per day. That's also a problem for toxicity. If you have any friends that kind of like to binge on Tums or just constantly take Tums, it can actually lead to constipation, which is a toxicity effect with calcium. So you can use them, but just make sure you're not taking more than like 3 a day. So what does cooking do to calcium? Just keep in mind, now that we're looking at minerals, these are basic elements. So like they're the basic elements of life, basically. So you can't really destroy them with cooking or heating. So that's not really going to be an issue here. So if you remember with vitamins, those are all big organic compounds. So obviously either light or anything like that can oxidize them, or heat. But the minerals are relatively stable, obviously, just because they're the basic elements. So heat's not a problem here. The main thing with minerals that kind of affects their absorption is things that bind to them in foods. So specifically something called phytates that's found in bran primarily, and that binds to the calcium in the food. So already in the food, it's attached to it. And then that would just decrease absorption unless you can some way liberate the calcium from the phytate. And so you can do, if you heat the bran a little bit and cook it, some of that calcium can be released from that phytate. We're going to be talking about phytates and oxalates a lot with minerals because that's the main thing that inhibits absorption. And it kind of varies from mineral to mineral what you can do. Sometimes they just bind irreversibly and sometimes heating helps them. So I'll show you for each one what works. Oxalates are the other thing that bind minerals in food. So these are found in green leafy vegetables like spinach and celery. So these also bind, or the other word for that is chelate, calcium. And then they kind of irreversibly bind, and that way the body can't have access to the calcium, so it's just excreted. Unfortunately, for oxalates and calcium, you can't liberate the calcium from the oxalate with heating. So basically, if it's attached to an oxalate, if you're eating spinach or celery and that contains calcium, you're not going to have access to any of that calcium because you can't liberate it from the oxalate. When we look at digestion, calcium is often found in salt form in the body, so that means it's attached to, other minerals. Let me just see if I'm actually recording here. Hopefully I am. And then that needs to be basically cut off from those other minerals, and that's done by hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Calcium is absorbed by two major processes. There's an energy-dependent process. So that's basically very similar to what we saw with the water-soluble vitamins, where the body will use an energy-dependent process to absorb calcium with low to moderate intakes. So it pretty much follows that same pattern. And then more of a passive process then for higher intakes. So remember, if there's not a lot of something coming into the body will expend energy or use its resources to try to pull more into the body. So this goes for the minerals. And then for when you have higher amounts, the body is like, oh, well, there's a lot coming in. I'm not going to spend any extra energy because we're just getting bombarded with this nutrient. So it will just allow it in through some type of passive process. So to give you a bit more detail here, the energy-dependent process is basically what we talked about in the vitamin D lecture. So calcium is absorbed attached to something called calbindin. So remember that from vitamin D. Vitamin D helps increase the synthesis of that. So calcium binds to the calbindin on the brush border. And then basically it travels across the enterocyte, still attached to the calbindin. And then it exits the enterocyte basically by an ATPase. This is basically an ATPase that is a calcium magnesium antiport system. So one calcium goes out while one magnesium comes in. There's also different absorption efficiencies for kind of different life stages. When someone's really young, so in the case of children, we actually absorb a lot more calcium than we do when we're older. And that's just because we're like building bones and that type of thing. And then as we get older, that usually goes down to closer to like 30%. Some people it can be up around 50%. But for most of us, we're only absorbing about 30% of the calcium that we take in. In pregnancy, it would also go up. That's just because we're basically building a whole new skeleton. So your body senses that and allows more calcium to come in. So, and again, that was just the energy-dependent process. So that's the calbindin process. The passive paracellular diffusion one is pretty simple. So again, that's the one that occurs when we have really high levels of calcium coming into the body. And so what happens is calbindin isn't activated as much. And calcium actually just kind of sneaks through. So paracellular, remember, means between cells. The calcium actually just sneaks through between those enterocytes. So a little bit can actually get in that way when you have really high amounts of calcium coming in. So that would be for those people that like take tons of Tums or something like that. With all the minerals, I'm also going to go through a slide that looks similar to this every time, looking at absorption inhibitors and then things that promote absorption. So absorption enhancers. So first, the things that inhibit calcium absorption, just keep in mind aging. So, as children, we're absorbing like 75%. That goes down to 30% when we're older. Fatty acids, if you have a very fatty meal, I believe it's more than 20 grams of fat in the meal, what happens is those fatty acids will form soaps, so micelles, kind of with the calcium incorporated. And then that inhibits absorption because it kind of traps the calcium in the micelles. And then that's just excreted, and the body basically doesn't have access to the calcium. Phytates and oxalates, obviously, talked about that. Those bind irreversibly in a lot of cases, so you can't get access to calcium. And then magnesium actually competes for absorption. So sometimes it can actually sneak through with calbindin. Absorption enhancers. If you have lower amounts of dietary calcium, your body is going to be primed to bring more in. Children, so life stages, children or pregnancy are going to increase absorption. It's been shown that if you take in vitamin D at the same time as calcium, that actually helps absorb a little bit more, and that's probably just because, it enhances calbindin synthesis. Lactose, so if you're taking in the dairy product kind of version of calcium or dairy foods with calcium, that's been shown to actually have the lactose itself is shown to improve solubility, which also increases the absorption of calcium. So a little bit more on supplements, just to kind of show you, we don't need to go through all the nitty-gritties of this, but basically, if you look at the percent absorption, it really does vary according to the form of the calcium in the supplement. So in order to obtain 500 milligrams of calcium, you would need to ingest these amounts of these different types. So all I'm trying to say here is calcium carbonate is the best absorbed. It also happens to be the cheapest. So if you're trying to recommend this to somebody or for yourself, look at the label and get the calcium carbonate version. That's usually the one that you want. So mainly because it's the best absorbed. And then supplements are usually about 40% calcium by weight. So even though you're seeing this like huge supplement, that's not all calcium. Usually they put in like cornstarch and stuff like that as fillers. But yeah, a lot of it's calcium, but just not all of it is. So transport, again, these slides for calcium itself, not super important, but just to point it out, it's absorbed primarily or transported in the free form. It can also be bound to albumin, so 40%, and then or sulfates. So albumin, just remember, is one of the main ways that we transport a lot of these nutrients around the body. Obviously, that varies from nutrient to nutrient. Fat-soluble vitamins, a lot of times they're just in chylomicrons, but for the water-soluble and minerals, a lot of times they're bound to albumin while kind of floating around the body. Regulation of cellular concentrations. So what I want to show you here is, or just talk about, is how do we regulate the amount of calcium that's one, extracellular, so that's in our bloodstream, or intracellular, so that's within the cell itself. So extracellular concentration, so that's how much gets kind of shuttled into the blood. And remember, that is pretty much exactly like what we learned in the vitamin D lecture. So calcium homeostasis, or calcium in the blood, is pretty much entirely regulated by vitamin D. And remember, that's with the kidneys, the intestines, and the bone. Intracellular is mainly through membrane channels, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that's basically how you move it out of storage sites like mitochondria into the cytosol. So first of all, regulation of extracellular concentrations. So again, how do we get it from different organs into the blood? This is, again, completely a review of what you learned in the vitamin D lecture. So if you understand that well, you can also look at those slides, but this is a very kind of simplified version of that. So remember, the first step is low blood calcium. The body senses that there's not that much calcium in the blood. It then signals the parathyroid to release parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone acts on bone to trigger the resorption, so the breakdown of bone, so then the bone releases calcium into the blood. The next thing that happens is that PTH, parathyroid hormone, acts on the kidney. The kidney then synthesizes or kind of converts more into calcitriol. The calcitriol then signals more calcium reabsorption. So basically, the PTH is telling the kidney to reabsorb more calcium. So don't just, basically urinate it all out. Like, we need more of it back in the body. So don't get rid of it. Let it come back into the bloodstream. Don't filter it out. Then, in the case of the intestine, remember that's the whole calbindin mechanism, where vitamin D basically helps with the synthesis of calbindin. And then if you have more calbindin on your brush border, so if you have more of these little guys kind of all over here, you're obviously going to absorb a lot more vitamin D when you have more of these. So that's all that is. And then eventually that calcium is shuttled into the bloodstream from the intestine. So basically those three things, kidney, intestines, and bone, again, help basically increase the amount of calcium in the blood. In case of intracellular, so how do we regulate calcium that is stored in little compartments in the cell? How do we get that to go into the cytosol? That's what I want to talk about next. So in general, there's not very high amounts of calcium in the cytosol. So there's low concentrations. So in order to basically get more into the cytosol, we'd get it from two different places. One would be the extracellular fluid. So extracellular fluid is outside the cell. And then intracellular sites. So places that have higher amounts of calcium inside are the mitochondria and the ER, endoplasmic reticulum. So in order to get it from, first of all, the extracellular site, so outside, simply calcium enters the cell in response to hormones or neurotransmitters. And this just simply occurs by transmembrane diffusion by membrane channels. So this is what's used in the case of the whole depolarization with nerve conduction. So that's just one of the ways that this is happening. But very basically, just know that it is through membrane channels. And then the way that we would get it out of the kind of intracellular pools or the storage sites within the cell, so mitochondria and the ER, that simply basically is released from those sites by a calcium-sodium antiport pump. So that's how we get them out of there. And then it's raised as a result. It's used very briefly. So again, in the case of nerve transmission, but then pretty much goes back to where it came from. So calcium concentrations return to normal very quickly after use. And this is accomplished by an ATP calcium pump that removes the calcium from the cell. So key functions of calcium, the main one that I'm sure you knew before taking the class is bone mineralization. So again, 99% of body calcium is actually used for that. Other things that it's used for is blood clotting, nerve transmission, and muscle contraction. And then, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about osteoporosis, prevention and treatment recommendations. So bone mineralization, just to kind of go back to probably some of your physiology classes to talk a bit about the basics of bone. Remember that there's two types of bone. There's cortical bone, So that's the stuff that's all on the outside. Your cortical bone is that outer layer, super compact and dense. That's 75% of your bone mass is the cortical outer layer. So that's the surface of all bones. The trabecular bone, on the other hand, is the inside of your bones. So it's that inner kind of spongy layer. That's 25% of the bone mass. And yeah, it's basically the interior region of the whole bone and then the ends of the bone as well. Something really important to keep in mind is that when your body is breaking down your bone to increase the amount of calcium in your bloodstream, it's mainly coming from this interior site. Your body's more likely to break down your trabecular inside or inner bone rather than your cortical outside bone. So that's kind of the part that gets depleted when calcium's low. And then just to kind of talk again, I know we talked about this again in the vitamin D lecture, but just remember that the way that bone is formed is that first proteins are laid down to make the bone matrix. So specifically collagen and osteocalcin are laid down in this kind of lattice here. So if you guys were in front of me right now, I would kind of show you with my fingers, interlacing my fingers to show you that it's like basically this lattice. And then in order to strengthen bone, you deposit minerals. And I kind of, when I talked about it in the vitamin D lecture, I just said deposit minerals. But what you need to know is that you don't deposit individual calciums or individual magnesiums. What you do is you deposit these compounds, specifically 3 different compounds. 2 salt compounds. So one of them's a calcium phosphate, and then the other one's magnesium phosphate. So this whole thing, these things enter and kind of fill up these little holes in the lattice. And the more they're filled up, the stronger the bone is. The other compound that fills up those little holes is called hydroxyapatite. It does not have magnesium in it. It's just calcium, phosphorus, and then hydroxyl group. So when you lay down this protein matrix, you want to then put in these 3 different compounds into the holes to kind of strengthen the bone. And then just a quick review too, remember osteoclasts, those are the ones that break down bone, and osteoblasts are the ones that make or form bone. And again, just a bit of a review probably from your physiology lecture. Osteoblasts, in order to make bone, the first thing that happens is osteoblast precursors are released from the bone marrow. So that's these little guys here. Those osteoblasts mature. So this is just showing you the kind of mature cell. Then it's those mature cells that basically help make bone in a few different ways. They are actually the ones that are secreting that kind of basic protein kind of lattice or layer of collagen and osteocalcin. So they lay down that protein matrix first. And then the osteoblasts also help facilitate mineralization. So they help those compounds, those salts and the hydroxyapatite be deposited kind of in the little holes between that protein matrix. So they're kind of not only laying down the kind of basics or the fundamental layer of the bone, but they're also helping to mineralize it. And then eventually those osteoblasts become kind of embedded in the newly formed bone. And then when that happens, they're then called or changed to osteocytes. And then a bit of a review for osteoclasts as well. So how do osteoclasts actually break down bone? So remember, osteoclasts mature in response to calcitriol, vitamin D. The osteoclasts, in order to kind of break down bone, they kind of clamp on to the outer layer of bone, or the inner layer as well, I should say. And then they secrete HCl and collagenases, which literally just kind of melt the bone. So they're kind of just like melting it away, and that way the minerals such as calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium are released. So also, I remember saying the last time I saw you guys, which was the vitamin D lecture, which think it was just like 2 weeks ago, but it seems like 3 months ago at this point. We went through something that looked very similar to this. I'll go through it in detail again for anyone that missed that lecture, but just to also review it a bit. So this is basically the life cycle of bone. So here we have general age, so from birth to 80 years old or so, and this is your bone mass. And then this one actually has, the one in the vitamin D lecture only had women, but this one has men as well. So men is kind of the darker line here. So key points from this, just remember peak bone mass for most people is reached around 25 or so. So by the time you're 25 years old, that's pretty much as good as it's going to get in terms of your bone mass. That's the highest bone mass you're going to have. And then after that, for both men and women, what happens is your bone mass stays relatively stable. So here it shows a bit more of a downwards curve than the previous figure that I showed you. But in general, it stays relatively stable until you're about 50 years old for women, or 51, which is the average age of menopause. And then for men, kind of, there's not much of like a downward turn, but it kind of just keeps on going down over their life. So things to keep in mind here, at the beginning of your life, so 0 to 25, formation of bone exceeds resorption. So basically, you're making a lot more bone than you're breaking down. And that's because the cells that make bone are way more active than the cells that break down bone from here to here. However, once a woman reaches menopause, or as a man ages, basically what happens is resorption, breakdown of bone, really starts to far exceed the formation of bone. And again, that's just because the cells that break down bone from here to here are way more active than the ones that were building it up. And then I also mentioned it really kind of takes a turn at menopause for women, and try to take a second there to see if you can remember why that is. But just to tell you the answer, since no one's here to answer me, it's basically because at menopause, women start making less estrogen. And estrogen has a really kind of crucial function in bone metabolism, in that estrogen causes the apoptosis of the cells that break down bone, so the osteoclasts. So to say it another way, estrogen helps kind of kill off the cells that break down your bone. So from throughout your life cycle as a woman, estrogen's kind of keeping the amount of cells that break down bone in line. So there's a nice balance between the ones that break down bone and the ones that make bone. Whereas after, when there's not enough estrogen being released, those cells that break down bone start becoming far more active and kind of out of control because estrogen's not there to kill them off. So that's why the bone starts breaking down a lot more. And testosterone has been shown to do the same thing. Testosterone helps with the apoptosis of osteoclasts as well, triggers that. So the same thing happens in men as their testosterone levels decrease. They don't have the same thing as women where it just kind of like plummets after menopause. They have more of a gradual decrease, so that's why you see this curve with men. So that's kind of what I wanted to say about osteoporosis, just kind of the basics of it, or sorry, bone formation, I should say. And then I'll talk a little bit in a couple slides about the treatment recommendations. So in terms of just kind of other basic functions, that all I want you to know is kind of what's on these slides, and really basically I just want you to remember that calcium is involved in blood clotting. Remember when the blood clotting factor is activated, calcium kind of binds in that V-shape thing that we talked about in the vitamin K lecture. So just remember, the only thing I really want you to know here is that it is involved in blood clotting. And then if you remember from your physiology classes and stuff we talked about before in this class, it also is involved in nerve conduction. So again, just to kind of very briefly go over this, remember first we have an action potential, so that travels down the nerve, that's that impulse that's being transmitted. It reaches the end of the neuron. This causes the membrane to become more permeable to calcium. So calcium then enters via that channel. And then once calcium enters the cell, this then causes the vesicle containing the neurotransmitter to move towards, so these are the neurotransmitters here. So calcium basically stimulates these guys to move down to the end of the cell, the synaptic cleft, and then the neurotransmitter is released, and it basically interacts with the next neuron, which then basically causes that whole, basically nerve conduction. For muscle contraction, the main thing I want you to know is that it's involved in muscle contraction. This is actually pretty complicated. But very basically, just remember that when a muscle is relaxed, those actin and myosin filaments that you probably learned about in your physiology classes do not overlap. Whereas when the muscle contracts, they do overlap. And I usually teach this by showing like my fingers interlaced overlapping or not. But very basically, what happens with calcium is calcium acts as a blocker. So in general, when this is actually beyond the scope of the course, all I really want you to know is that it's involved in muscle contraction. But when the muscle actually wants to contract, there's calcium that's in there and it needs to kind of be ejected before the muscle can contract. But again, you don't really need to know that, and it's far more complicated than that. That's kind of just a basic way to say it. But just know, yeah, calcium's involved in muscle contraction. So, I do say it. So, in a very basic way, I guess, as well. So calcium causes a conformational change in the actin filament. So again, basically, calcium's there kind of as a blocker. And then when the muscle is contracting, the calcium needs to be removed so the muscle can contract. So it's kind of there as a blocker and it needs to be ejected. So those are the basic functions. Again, bone mineralization is the main thing that calcium does in the body, but it is also involved in blood clotting, nerve transmission, and muscle contraction. And then now just to talk about osteoporosis kind of treatment and prevention recommendations. So remember, osteoporosis is the progressive loss of bone density. So that's when that bone matrix basically has less and less minerals deposited in those little holes, which makes it pretty frail and vulnerable to fractures. So very important, if you remember anything from this lecture, this is probably the thing that's going to be the most important for your dietetic practice. So please remember this: prevention and treatment guidelines. So when someone does not have osteoporosis, so if they just have maybe a mother or a father that had it and they'd like to prevent it, the guidelines for this, for calcium, are to take the RDA levels of calcium. So again, that's 1,000 for premenopausal women and men, and 1,200 for postmenopausal women. And then for prevention, it's just the normal RDA levels of vitamin D3. So that again is 1,500 micrograms per day, or just the 600 IUs. Treatment, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Calcium, you're still taking in the RDA levels. And then vitamin D3, that's the thing that changes here. You need a little bit more D3 for the treatment. So that goes up to 20 micrograms per day for that. So those are the differences. But yeah, definitely please know those. If you are working with people that have osteoporosis, you'll definitely be working with a doctor as well, because it can get pretty bad. But just in terms of prevention, definitely, if you're working with any, even if you're working in a weight loss clinic, you should definitely ask people if they have a history of osteoporosis in their families, and then definitely get them to try to consume these levels of calcium and D3. And as I'll show you in a couple slides, most people consume definitely not enough calcium. Most people consume only half the amount of calcium that we need. So it's important to kind of make sure from an early age that they're getting those levels to prevent osteoporosis. Some other recommendations are, this has also been suggested, that women not taking estrogen should have bit higher amounts, so 1,500 milligrams per day. That's definitely you can do. That's definitely something that you can suggest. doesn't come close to the toxicity levels. Toxicity, or TUL, is 2,500, so it's still well below that. So that's something you can do for your patients that are not taking estrogen after menopause. The other really important thing is definitely avoid alcohol and smoking. And then also, really, really important, perform weight-bearing exercise. So if you're performing, and it doesn't have to be like full-on resistance training in a gym. This is just like carrying things, like taking the stairs more often or lifting things is really important. That will promote bone mineralization. I always say, I always think whenever I'm in a grocery store and I see somebody offering like an older woman to carry their grocery bags out to the car, I'm always like, oh, well, probably not doing much for that person's bone mass, because, she'd do a lot better if she like carried her own grocery bags. So basically just stuff like that. Very basic. Just try to carry things, try to take the stairs. You don't have to do a full-on resistance training program to boost bone mineralization in that way. Moving on to excretion. In general, it's about half and half, I'd say. There's calcium's excreted both in the urine and in the feces. A little bit more in the urine, I guess. But remember that whole thing with vitamin D, this is all I'm trying to show you here, is that in general we lose about 100 to 250 milligrams per day in our urine of calcium. But then when the body senses that blood calcium is low, remember PTH signals the kidney to basically increase calcium reabsorption. So that can vary too. So basically, you're going to release a lot less calcium in your urine if you have kind of lower body stores. Fecal excretion ranges from 45 to 100 milligrams per day. And then that usually can increase, so you can release a lot more calcium if you're eating foods that contain phytates and oxalates. So you're going to excrete a lot more in your feces if you're eating those types of foods. In terms of DRIs, just to point out again the things that you need to know for the exam. For males, it's 1,000. Females, 19 to 50, it's 1,000 milligrams per day. And then for postmenopausal women, it's 1,200 milligrams per day. And basically this intake level is associated with optimal bone mineral density. When I started teaching this class, they didn't have this number here for premenopausal women. It was just at 1,000 basically before, but they're realizing that postmenopausal women will need to take in this much to basically help maintain their bone mass. And then also just looking at, just in terms of deficiency, so how much calcium do Americans take in? So let me explain this a little bit. This is calcium intake here in milligrams per day. Different age groups, so children all the way up to people over 50. This is men, this is the woman, and then there's also race, so white and black. And then what might be helpful for you to kind of interpret this data is if you put a line across here at the 1,000, because that's kind of how much calcium we're supposed to be getting. And then for women over 50 here, you might want to put something around 1,200. And when you have those lines there, you'll notice that pretty much no one, very few groups are actually getting enough calcium. So if you look, a lot of people are really just getting between anywhere from 400 to 600 milligrams per day, which is pretty far off of that 1,000 that we need. If you look at the postmenopausal women, which need 1,200, they're only getting 500 or 600 or so, so only about half of what they need. For some reason, the only group that's actually seems to be getting enough are men between the ages of 11 to 24 who are white. Those are the only people that get enough. And again, not quite sure why that is, but yeah, that's kind of how it all plays out. But in general, people don't get enough calcium. And I think that's probably why they've started really boosting the amount of calcium in different types of products, or why they're fortifying so many things. I haven't seen any convincing data to show that the fortification is actually helping boost these levels, but I don't know if if the NHANES has actually done an analysis since 5 or 10 years ago when they started doing that, but I could check. So other deficiency kind of are just the actual deficiency disorders of calcium are pretty much something that you probably already knew. In children, again, it's rickets, so that was the same for vitamin D. Remember, that's when the body of the child, basically their bones, they have a lot of that matrix being released, that protein matrix, but there's not enough minerals being deposited into that kind of rubbery matrix. So then the weight of the child's body then causes the bowing of these bones, just because they're not mineralized enough to be strong enough to not kind of, they're just so rubbery that they kind of just like go off to the side a little bit. And then in terms of whether or not this can be corrected, most children do need braces to kind of try to correct this, but most of the time they have kind of those deformities for the rest of their lives. In adults, it's osteoporosis. So that's the next step that comes after osteomalacia that we learned about for vitamin D. So osteomalacia is bone pain. It's kind of the first step of this. And then when there's basically a lot less mineralization happening, that's when osteoporosis sets in. And then again, as we learned before, that basically increases the risk of bone frailty and susceptibility to fractures. And then also just to point out, the main things that break when somebody has osteoporosis is their wrists, because people fall, their wrists and their hips. So they fall down and their wrists generally just snap from falling down, or their hips can kind of fracture. So those are the two areas where we see a lot of fractures with osteoporosis. Toxicity is set at 2,500 milligrams per day. So remember, in comparison, it's about twice or so the amount that of the RDA. Chronic high intakes, so for people that are taking a lot of Tums or something like that, people that take more than 3,000 milligrams a day for 6 months, the toxicity effects that people usually see with high amounts of calcium is constipation. So again, lots of Tums can lead to constipation. And then if you're doing this for years and years, it can lead to kidney stones. One other thing that doesn't happen, it's really kind of very particular to a certain group of people, is something called milk alkali syndrome. So milk alkali syndrome generally happens in the elderly. I was actually going to take this out of the slides, but I talked to a friend of mine working as a dietitian with the elderly, and she said that keep it in because she still sees this. So basically what it is it's when, I don't know how this happened honestly, but there was this, somebody came up with this somehow, and it doesn't make sense. But people think that in order to treat stomach ulcers, that you should take in high amounts of milk in combination with antacids, so like Tums. So in order to treat stomach ulcers, they're using kind of these two things that have high amounts of calcium in it. So milk, and then also Tums or antacids. And then if you do that for kind of more than a year or so, it can actually lead to soft tissue calcification, which means that calcium will basically get embedded in your heart and kidney and all this type of thing. And then it can lead to organ failure, specifically renal failure. So that's something, again, that's really specific to the elderly, because it was something that was said to help with ulcers. It definitely doesn't help with ulcers, so don't tell anyone to do it, but that it's specific to that population group. So yeah, in general, just remember, for most people, the things that they're going to notice with kind of higher levels of calcium intake is constipation and kidney stones. And then for the elderly, if they're doing this kind of treatment for ulcers with milk and Tums, they're going to get something called milk alkali syndrome. All right, that's pretty much all I have for this lecture. So again, if there's any kind of clarification points, feel free to email me, or if you feel totally lost, the tutor is still available, so please contact her. Great, thanks. Have a great rest of your day.